All right, everybody awake? Let's see what we can do about that. So we have here again, and we are very honored for that, Dan Rubin. And I think he needs no further introduction, therefore I will just give the word to him, and he will tell us why we don't talk anymore.
Oh, come on, yes, you can do that. I would apologize for bringing you here at 9 a.m., but it wasn't my fault. Blame Marcus. And you. How many of you went to the party last night? Okay, cool. How many of you are feeling like you shouldn't have gone to the party last night? Oh, just 2 of you. All right. I'll try to go easy on you. I'm actually going to start by, this has nothing to do with me being on at 9. I'm not a morning person, but I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the conference. Not in a bad way. It just ends up being the people who run the conference are fantastic people, but it gives me a perfect example to start talking about at least the early part of my session today, and that is this 2-track setup. There are a lot of conferences that are in the kind of web software app world. There isn't really one industry anymore. It's just kind of a mixture of industries that we all build things for that run on different platforms. But we see a lot of separation. What I'm talking about today is kind of the topic of separation, of how we divide ourselves, and we do it very naturally. And it happens to an uncomfortable degree without us intentionally doing it. And what I mean by this is we see it in teams a lot where we're constantly discussing issues between communication between designers and developers, right? Specifically those 2 groups. We have other groups that we don't like talking to sometimes, but there's this divide between designers and developers. And some of us are lucky enough to never see it or not see it on a regular basis when we work really closely with people. Especially that happens with a lot of small teams, which I'll get into. But like the way that this conference is split up is one of the great examples of how naturally that separation can happen without us intentionally trying to build up walls between groups. It happens because we try to categorize things. So the conference here, we have this design and development tracks. I'm talking about something that's not really specific to design or development. It's actually to both, but because there are 2 tracks, I have to end up in one. And I'm also primarily a designer, even though I've spent a lot of time in the web in past years. I've spent a good 15 years in the world of web standards, and as a designer, pushing better development. And if we look at these tracks, what I find interesting is that because of this natural kind of separation, logical separation of design and development, what we end up with is things that are in one that people in the other would be interested in. I'm actually really interested in PPK's talks all the time. CSS grid layout, is CSS design or development? How do we decide between those? Style sheets, developers usually are the ones, even for front-end developers working on this stuff. Responsive typography. It's actually a lot of the stuff in the design track is kind of development-related things, not back-end development, but I'm actually, as a designer who likes to understand how things work, I'm really interested in a lot of things that are on the development track as well. And then we end up with this thing, like we're talking about UX development. Well, user experience ends up being something that people who are labeled designers end up spending a lot of time with. And then, we've got a performance talk in the design track, right? There's basically total overlap. There are a couple of sessions in each that are, you could consider very specific, but in general, there's a lot of overlap because those of us who build things for the web, for instance, we spend so much time, I think, in that environment of everything being created that it doesn't matter what our task is or what our job title is. We tend to be very interested in what's happening in the other sides. And overall, this shows that separation happens very easily once we start to categorize. And we start to categorize and organize and put things in buckets because we're humans. This is not something that's specific to the web or tech or any of our particular industries. It's something that's been going on for millennia. As long as humans have been around, we've been separating ourselves in various ways. So we are pack animals. Humans like to be in groups. We like to congregate together. We're not inherently kind of solo animals. We prefer the company of others to solitude, to being on our own. And yet, we're extremely adept, I think, at isolating ourselves, even when we're in the company of others. So we do it in conferences all the time, but also in other situations when we're in groups. We're physically in a group, but we're mentally isolated. So this is the first thing I want to look at here, is how natural this tendency is. So again, this isn't new. I promise I won't be reading you quotes all day, but this is a quote from the Journal of Education publication in 1907. So not yesterday, right? And this person is talking about, our modern family gathering, silent around the fire, each individual with his head buried in his favorite magazine. You could replace the word magazine there with tablet or phone or anything else like that, right? And it would still be valid today. This has been happening all the time. Groups of people together, we could talk face to face, but instead of that, we're finding some way to disconnect from each other. And this picture here is from the 1940s in the New York subway. Right, everyone right next to each other, but not making eye contact, looking at their newspaper. And it's the same today and on platforms in London. It just doesn't matter where you go. People are around other people because that's what we like, but we're separating ourselves into our own little private world. So that's our natural tendency to isolate ourselves. So put that in one bucket. Then segregation on a larger scale. So rather than individuals, because that happens naturally, it also tends to happen naturally, but for other reasons on a much larger scale. So whether that's due to gender, race, age, financial status, education, politics, it doesn't matter kind of what category it's in. Examples aren't hard to find. In either recent history, with the Berlin Wall, that's one great example of large-scale separation and segregation. The Great Wall of China is another one. We're really good at building walls and separating ourselves as humans. And again, it happens not without conscious thought, but it happens kind of naturally. We form groups and we keep ourselves away from the other groups. And we decide at some point that the way that this group feels is different than the way that group feels, so we don't want anything to do with them. It happens over and over again because it's a natural tendency, the same as that pattern of individual isolation when in groups of people. And in modern terms, we talk a lot about wanting more human connection because we feel, I think, that we spend so much time using technology as the way that we communicate, which is a new thing. Although maybe people were complaining about this when smoke signals were the normal way to complain. Maybe people would sit around the fire and say, you know what, we should go and see the next tribe because we're only just talking to them through smoke signals. I wouldn't be surprised if people did complain about that. And when the telegraph became a thing and everyone was so excited that we could communicate across an ocean by sending telegrams, there were probably people at some point very soon after who complained that we were now sending telegrams to people in the next town rather than going to see them. Right, and we were cutting ourselves off. Technology does that. And yet, so we talk about wanting more, and yet we're building things that allow us to communicate more without face-to-face contact. So we're closing ourselves off on a regular basis to more human interaction, even as we say we need more. So whether it's the time we spend in Facebook, or even, I love images like this, because you see people doing this all the time, this attraction to isolation. Maybe in a public space, head in the laptop, headphones on. It's this, to me, observing this on such a regular basis is fascinating. Whether we're in groups or individuals, we seem strangely attracted to that isolation. As much as we talk about wanting the deeper connections, our actions say otherwise. And that's because we're naturally drawn to that, I think, as much as we want to rationalize otherwise. And this behavior, I think, directly translates into how we work as teams. whether that's a team inside an agency or inside a larger company, or working with other teams, whether that's a client's team and your team. We're all people. That's the consistent mark. So we've got those two things, the natural tendency for isolation and the natural tendency to segregate ourselves as groups. Let's put those away for a second. Those will make sense as I dig deeper. So looking at these patterns of creating silos or building walls around things, the reason this is a natural tendency is because as humans, we need to build, let's call them mental models, because we're all familiar with what a mental model is, and as a psychological concept, I think that works really well for just how we move through the world. In order for us to understand our place in a given situation, in a given context, we need to understand everything about that context and how we fit into it. That's where roles come in. We usually call them job titles a lot. I think that's where job titles come in. But it's a way that we can easily tie a bow around our role. So let's look at the idea of roles for a minute and why we all feel so strongly like we need to have them. They're a good thing. It's not a bad thing. I'm not saying we should do away with any of these. I want to make sure we all understand why we need them and why we behave this way by default. So again, one of the only other things I'm going to read to you, I think this is important. The definition of a role, right? The first one I think is interesting, right? A character assigned or assumed. The term role comes from theater, but it ends up being used now everywhere. So it started with kind of theater, so the character comes out that way. A socially expected behavior pattern usually determined by an individual's status in a particular society. I think that says a lot about why we use them. That B definition, a part played by an actor or a singer. So it's a part, a character. It doesn't mean that we are that person. It's not our identity. It's our identity in that particular context. I think that's very important, right? We need that. Even the second one, a function or part performed especially in a particular operation or process, that's more of how we're used to thinking about it, I think, in business. So why do we do this? Well, it helps us understand the world around us and its most basic parts. We see roles in this pattern of human behavior in a lot of places, and we start defining these before we even understand language. Right? This is very, very inherent behavior. And this is important because what I'm leading to is why we need to override it. So here are some examples about how we make these binary definitions really early on. Right? This is how we start to understand the world even before we can describe it. You know, male and female, we're categorizing because that's how we understand when we're young. Adult and child, apples and oranges, apples and other things. Right? This language of separation, I think, is it's embedded. It's rampant throughout our entire world. It's how we relate to things. Tall, short. That tells us a whole lot. Expensive, cheap. It's not a bad thing because without these basic ways of categorizing, everything would be the same and everything would be, we wouldn't be able to navigate through the world. So this is a really inherent, natural, unplanned part of how humans react. Even with things like wires and cables, we've got the male and female components. Separation is just part of how we identify things because of how we learn to identify things at a very, very early age. That's our base mental model, and we build on that through our entire life. We even do it with things like behavior. We define things as childlike, immature, grown up. That allows us to put things in a particular category, and it's a common language that we all understand. It's not very specific, but that's the point. It doesn't have to be specific to give us enough of a picture that we can understand. And it's not a surprise, I think, that we do any of this. And it's one of the reasons why I think we all like looking at how children interact with things and with the world around them, because we get to see the purest version of that binary understanding. It's not clouded by all the shades of gray that we build up as we get older, as we become adults and we learn that there are minute differences between different contexts. Children just get to look at and say, well, it's that or it's that. And their behavior, because of that, is much more clear, much easier for us to understand because there aren't any layers of complexity. So roles are important. They create a framework for us. We understand why frameworks are important when we're building things and designing things, whether it's a framework that's a process framework or it's an actual literal development framework. It doesn't matter. It's a pattern that we can reproduce, and patterns allow us to understand things more deeply and to work more efficiently. They give us a framework for living. The standardization, basically, is this idea of frameworks and patterns that allow us to do things more easily. When we talk about groups and teams and companies, those frameworks, those roles, those positions, those job titles allow us to move between those teams more easily. If you're a designer on this team and now you're going to look for another job, having that role in mind, that context around a position, allows you to look for another one and for them to know that you're a right fit for it. Makes sense. So it's not a bad thing. More examples here. So before I left the States, I've been living in the UK for just over a year now. Before I left the States, I did a lot of singing. I actually spent 24 years singing. It was a hobby, but the amount of times that I did it, or the amount of time I spent doing it, was a full-time job. So it was 4-part harmony, barbershop harmony. I was the baritone. My brother there was the tenor. And a lot of the time we actually looked like that. This guy is great. He was our bass. This is the last quartet I was in. He's like 6'4", and he worked full-time at Disney. He played Gaston in the Beauty and the Beast show. That was his full-time job. So he looks like Gaston, and he sounds like Gaston. And he's fantastic. But so in 4-part harmony, we've got 4 distinct parts. Without those roles being defined, then we wouldn't be able to assign them and evaluate them and become good at them. I'm going to continue hammering on this so we can understand exactly how deep this idea of separation runs through us. So we've got voice parts. They're not called roles, right? They're called voice parts, but it's the same thing. In a quartet, you have to know whether you are the tenor, the lead, the baritone, or the bass. Unless you know what your voice part is, you don't know what part to look at on the sheet music. You don't know how to evaluate your own performance. You don't know who to ask for help and assistance on whether you're doing your voice part right. If you don't know anything about your position in the whole unless you have that definition, unless you've built that mental model. And most importantly, I think, for us, unless we know those things, we can't get better at them. And it applies in all these different parts of our life. Again, theater, literally roles. Once your role is defined, you know what part to read in the script and how to create a personality around that role. Without it, you don't know how to exist in that context. Sports, the same kind of thing. How many of you don't like football? That's a better question to ask, right? More of you than I would have assumed. I don't really watch it, but I used to play it. I love it. But even those of you who don't like it, right? If I say goalie or striker or midfield, I bet you know exactly where that is. You could point to where those positions are on a field, right? Because the mental model of football as a sport includes those positions and those definitions, and you just can't help but learn them, at least in a basic way. So this idea of defining ourselves, defining positions within a whole, it's just how we are as humans. We can't help it. It's how we work. We shouldn't try to change it because it would break things. Our natural tendency is to do this, and it's a common element, and it gives us a language of understanding in different contexts. Now, where this starts to break down is where we get a little too specific. I really hate job titles as a way to define ourselves, because when you allow smart people to define their own roles, their own titles, they spend too much time thinking about it. Most of these are the same. We could look at them and we could talk about them for hours and on end, and what the detailed differences are between them. But I bet most of you have had more than one title over the years, and I bet that the differences in those titles are greater than the differences in the actual work at some times. I don't know, personally, I was a webmaster at one point 20 years ago. I don't think any title that I've ever given myself since has been that high up the chain. Webmaster. I could have got Web King, would have been great. Web Prince, We could have designed Prince, designed King. It all got lower down the food chain as we went. We started at the top and it was all downhill. The reason we do this is because we're constantly trying to understand our role, to understand our position in the whole better, because we want to do a good job. The better we understand our role, the better we just understand where we fit in the bigger story, the better job we can do. Same as with that example of the quartet. The difference with the quartet is there are 4 parts. Once you figure out what part you are, you waste no more time trying to figure out what part you are. You do the part. Your focus becomes doing the work, learning the material, becoming as good as you possibly can at that role, because in that framework, that's all there is. And that makes it easier to become really, really good at what you're doing and understand the rest of that framework. Because our industry changes, and industry is still a word I'd like to find a better term for, because it's not just one thing, but because the stuff that we do changes so rapidly, our understanding of how we do it and where we fit in also changes rapidly. I think that's what leads us to coming up with job titles and changing them all the time. Suddenly we have user experience as a thing. Right? 10 years ago, UX wasn't used. 5 years ago, UX wasn't something we saw as initials everywhere. Strangely, I think I found myself referencing user experience design about 15 years ago. I can't figure out if I came up with that first or if someone else was already using it. Probably someone else was. I won't take credit for that. But we change throughout the industry a lot because we're trying to figure out what it is today, what it is tomorrow, what it might be next week, and how that's different from what it was last year, and how we need to change individually. That's why we're attracted to those kind of talk titles or articles or books. They're attempts to be as specific as we can so that we can do that. We're confident that we're doing the best job we possibly can. How many of you in here on the design track happen to call yourself designer? Not just that one word, but somewhere in the title or in the way you refer to yourself even is design or designer. Okay. For everyone who didn't raise your hands, let's see, something in your title or the way you would describe yourself as developer? Couple. Engineer? Right. Some of you who are developers are also engineers. Are you a development engineer? That'd be fun. Let's see, any managers here? A couple? Okay, good. Well, the managers are in more of a position to actually change and fix some of this stuff. Who didn't raise your hand? Or, yeah, who didn't raise your hand? You. What are you? Okay, great. Architect. There we go. Well, we've had any information architects in here as well. No, see, that term used to be around all the time. Now, no one's an information architect anymore. They're doing other things. Right, but they're still doing information architecture. So what does this achieve? We do this, right? It happens, now that I think we've set the stage that it happens, and it happens naturally, and why it happens, and it's not a bad thing that it does happen. So it achieves lots of good things. Let's look at the positives for a minute. It allows us to assign responsibility. In general, task-wise, and I think tasks are where tasks and responsibilities are where these are most beneficial, these understandings of roles. If I'm on a project with Tim, hi Tim. If I'm on a project with Tim, like we were last year, I was design lead on the project. For that project, I think project-specific roles are much better, personally for me, because I don't ever do one thing. I've never done one thing. I've done everything. And I continue to want to do more things. But in a project, I need to have a role, a job, a responsibility. That meant that if there was anything design-related as a decision that needed to be made, it might be made by someone else on the team, but at some point it was going to go through me. I was maybe going to do some of the, more of the design-related production work. There was a lot of overlap, though, in the team, which is what happens a lot with really good teams, is that there's not a complete separation. There's separation of responsibility, but the tasks we all know about, and we're all going to end up doing some of that work. Even when it's unplanned, there are a lot of engineers, people who are writing software, who are creating the user experience, whether they know it or not. And usually you do know it. And you're also creating the design elements, layout elements, position, like interaction. the title doesn't somehow stop you from doing one particular kind of work. And this is good. But when we subdivide too many times, not just in the roles, but I think when we get more specific, what happens is that our inherent human behavior that I talked about at the beginning starts to kick in. A lot of different things happen at that point. So defining responsibility and tasks and understanding how a team's going to work on a project, that's the good that comes out of roles and those definitions. The bad actually runs pretty deep, and it creates a lot of problems with achieving the good things. So the biggest thing for me is that it dilutes our work a lot of the time. What we're trying to accomplish is to build this thing together, whatever it is, product or a project for a client, doesn't really matter. It can be hardware as well. That's the goal for the team. We're doing this. And yet, when we have these arguments and these disagreements within a team, these tend to be because we've gone a little too deep with our separation. So an example for you, in 2011, 2012, I was the creative director at moo.com. Any of you have their business cards? Yeah, I know you do. The little mini cards, that's what they became popular for. I know they do a whole lot of other things. But I want to tell you some stories about things that happened while I was at Moo, things that I observed while I was inside. They're a fantastic brand, very, very friendly, very human. If you've ever ordered something from Moo, you know that the communication you get, the automated communication, all comes from something they call Little Moo. Now, rather than it's just coming from the system, Little Moo is the system, but it allows them to personify it. It allows them to give it language that a system wouldn't have. And it means because this is a kind of another good example of roles in a weird way, because they've given it that identity, it gives them reason to always pay attention to everything that they write. The copy that they write for Little Moo is brilliant. And it shows up in some of their print stuff too. Has anyone ever found the hidden messages in the packaging? One. Okay, yeah. And the rest of you who raised your hands and have bought Moo stuff will go back home and check your packaging if you haven't thrown it away. So they're a very human company. They seem, from the outside especially, very user experience focused, very good brand language, very consistent brand, great customer service, all these things, all these positives. On the inside, it's also a very positive environment. People love working there. But they've scaled very, very rapidly since they started. I think the first year of Moo, when they were called Moo, was 2006. And they were a handful of people around one table. When I joined at the end of 2011, there were about 80 people, I think, 80 or 90 between the US and the UK, founded in the UK, small team in the US. When I left a year later, they were more than double that size. And in the 2 years since, they've kind of doubled and doubled again, which is insane. I mean, it's great for them business-wise, but that's a lot of new people. When I was there, they were adding 2 new hires a week. And when you're adding 2 new hires, yeah, exactly, that reaction right there, like, wow. There wasn't enough time to onboard all of them because there was so much going on. You're adding these people, and you're kind of like, yeah, okay, that's your job, sit at that desk, we'll give you stuff. And one of the things that happens at speed, I think, is that we lose sight of certain things that we need to protect. And we find this in projects. If you've ever had to do a project with too tight a deadline, what happens? You cut corners, right? Things get missed. Not because you actually intentionally cut a corner, but because you ran out of time to do stuff, to even think about stuff. So things get missed. This happens with teams when they scale, and most of the time, scaling happens too quickly. It happens rapidly rather than very, very carefully. When it happens carefully, you find that those problems go away. But so in Moo, we had weird separation of teams, which for a great environment and a great brand, I felt was very strange. So for instance, one of my favorite examples is that members of the UX team, well, only small, it was 2 or 3 people, I remember on a couple of occasions, they got upset when someone else created a wireframe. Right? Yeah. When you explain it that simply, it doesn't sound logical, right? But that logic doesn't kick in when you're in the thick of a project. I had a talented UI designer on the creative team, and he he knew everything about interaction design. So when we were starting things off, he would make wireframes, like not to show to higher ups, but to give to the UX team to kind of explain on that level what he might be thinking and to give input. But because of the environment, because of how in Moo, it was an interesting thing. Everyone was very protective of their role, and what they fell back on was their job description. The number of times I had conversations with people where they were getting testy about what someone else was doing, crossing over into their territory, they would always mention their job description. It was really, really odd. I don't think anyone realized how much they were doing it. And it was a cultural thing where, no, you can't be doing wireframes. It's not in your job description. That's mine. It was very, very kind of childlike behavior in that way. Also on the developer side, again, I had members of my team who knew how to do front-end dev. On the development team was about 40 people when I was there. And of those, about 2 or 3, I think, could do front-end dev, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Everyone else was kind of a mixture of various back-end technologies, because that's what Moo was driven on. So they could kind of use the help every once in a while, and I could do front-end as well as a couple of my designers. And when we were to do that and kind of hand it to the dev team for them to review and put it into their systems however they wanted to, they like rejected it flat out. They didn't want it because it wasn't our job to do. It was really, really confusing. I had to fight for that over a year to just be able to say, look, we've been trying to get this little menu fix into a sprint for 6 months. I'm just going to do it and give it to you. And when you feel you can do your QA on it, get it in. And I finally was able to beat them over the head enough that my 5-minute fix could actually get into the production cycle. That's silly, right? It's really, really silly. But that happens because when we're in the thick of things, and things get busy, things get stressful, and as humans, when things get stressful, we lose the ability to think laterally. You know, in horse terms, we kind of get the blinders on. We can just look straight ahead. When that happens, we close down and we revert to the basics of what we know. And that's where those roles and the mental model around those roles becomes really important, because our basic default behavior is to just go back to the most narrow definition of that and be very protective of our space. This is our natural behavior. It's not a surprise. It happens all the time. So talking about scaling, we see small teams that don't have this problem. And at Moo, I think this was a great example, because I wanted to learn why it happened at Moo. So when Moo started out, it was 3 or 4 people sitting around a table. Well, what happens when you're 3 or 4 people sitting around a table? You talk to each other. Not because that's part of your process, not because you've got some sort of mandate poster on the wall that says we need to talk to each other, we all need to discuss things. No, it's because you're there, you're looking at each other. You know, you go out for coffee together because there's no team like to schedule these things with. You're small and these things happen. It's why small startups can be really, really nimble. Actually, I don't think small startup is the right way to call it. Have you ever seen a large startup? Someone who just 400 people. That doesn't happen, right? So you've got these small teams that when they start, they make decisions very quickly. There's no hierarchy, there's no bureaucracy, and most importantly, there's no lack of communication. Everyone on the team is wearing multiple hats, and everyone on the team knows what everyone else on the team is doing, not because you're of anything intentional, but because of the size. This is important. So naturally, in this environment, we communicate. Because we have to, because we can, because it's the natural thing to do. Get a little bit bigger, that's probably not going to break, because you're still able to sit around the same table. If you get to the point where you're sitting at multiple tables, that might be a little bit more complex. Maybe more people are having their headphones in while they're working, just because there's conversation going on at that table, and that's going to distract me, so I'm just going to work with my headphones in, right? I see a couple of nodding heads. Then it gets bigger and you're not at multiple tables, you're kind of in multiple, you've now bought a whole floor in a new building and you've got the departments starting to take shape. And now if you need to talk to someone, they're not right across from you, they might be on the other side of the room, and the natural tendency is not to get up and talk to them. You might use chat, or you might send them an email, something like that. But that is where naturally the normal, easy communication is starting to break down, because unless you know that you have to encourage that face-to-face all the time, it's not going to happen, because it's now that much harder. And then you break into proper teams where you've got, like at Moo, we had teams split across multiple floors. Not just teams split across multiple departments. So if I wanted to talk to the CTO about something as creative director, I needed to go upstairs, leave my desk. Not hard. I did it all the time, but the number of times that I had people come over to my desk, walk over to my desk, to ask me if I'd seen the email they sent earlier, blew my mind. They wouldn't ask me the question they'd put in the email, which I hadn't had a chance to see because I'd been in meetings all day. They could have done that, but they could have also hunted me out and asked, and usually they were short questions that we could have had a 30-second discussion over. But because of the size, other patterns had developed naturally, and these are not unique patterns to Moo, they're normal, they happen everywhere. The unique patterns are the ones that we see only a few times, and we look at and we say, how the hell do they do it so well over there? And what happens is that they do it intentionally. They recognize that when you grow, or when you're just dealing with other teams too, there are a lot of contexts where this works. When you grow, things change. We have to acknowledge that before we can start manipulating it into changing things intentionally or avoiding the natural change that results in bad behavior that we don't want. So processes change, right? Methodologies are introduced, whether it's agile or anything else. Complex systems of approval and hierarchy, which you don't have when we're in a small team. Paperwork, meetings, scheduling, complexities of all sorts. Those happen naturally because they have to, because we've now got more people and it's harder to communicate. And then that protective nature kicks in when their roles are too firmly defined as well. Because if you've got 2 new people joining a company a week, it's very quick. Only a couple of months are needed before you might not recognize half the people who are in the lunchroom, right? And our natural tendency is to be a little xenophobic. We're scared of the new. And when there's a lot of turnover inside a company, we're going to get more protective over our position. That's where that starts to happen. I don't want you edging into my territory because I might lose my job if you're too good at it. Right? That's where that protective nature kicks in. So one of the ways for us to manage this when we're scaling is to think like a smaller company. And if you're in a small company and you don't have these problems yet, this is the best time to actually be aware of this because you don't know when you're going to scale. That usually ends up being a surprise when it happens rapidly. Somehow you've just suddenly got a massive project and you now need to acquire another agency because otherwise you can't do the work, or you're going to pull on a ton of freelancers, or you might just go on a hiring sprint, or you got acquired yourself, or there are lots of other things that happen. Maybe you get the funding you've been trying to get for 18 months and now you need to triple the size of the team. These things don't happen with a lot of warning. You need to be prepared for them ahead of time. So a couple of basics here then. The larger the group, the easier it is to excuse ourselves from communicating. We see this happen all the time. How many of you, how many attendees are at this conference? What's the rough count? Someone? How much? 200 something? Right? Okay. That's not a lot of people. It's a lot of people. The Dunbar number is at 120 or so. So we shouldn't expect to know everyone. But how many of you have actually met a whole lot of people that you didn't know before the last few days? Okay, a couple, right? It doesn't naturally happen, right? With larger groups, we're more likely to just kind of walk in, get our coffee, maybe, we see a familiar face, we're going to go for them. It happens in companies too. The larger the group, the easier it is to just come up with easy social excuses for not communicating. They're on the other floor, I'll just send them an email. Or we've got hip chat, I'll just chat, that's convenient. I won't interrupt them. We make these excuses as positive things a lot of the time. So a couple of other examples of teams that have handled that scaling in a really interesting way and think in a smaller way to avoid that natural tendency to excuse ourselves from communicating. Big Spaceship, have you heard of these guys? They're out of Brooklyn in New York. They're a decent-sized agency. You know, when I visited their offices a few years ago, they were somewhere between 60 and 80 people, I think. They might be larger now, but they're not 4 people. They're not 10 people. The interesting thing about Big Spaceship, it's fascinating to me how they structure their teams. They've got small teams that work on the projects. So their teams are made up of all the people you would need to get most of the work done. You have a design director, you have someone in charge of development, you've got someone who's the account manager. Each of those roles that you would need when you say, okay, what do we need to do a web project, an interaction design project? They have them all on the one team. If they need more help, they can go to some of the other teams because the company is a resource for every team. But what you end up having is, and I learned a lot of this from my friend Dan Mall, and I visited when Dan Mall was still there, and he kind of walked me through how they work. And what it means is you've got a team that's like Dan Mall was design director for his team. It meant that his tiny little team did the StarWars.com redesign, Crayola, Barbie, all these massive brands done by a really, really tiny team at a not so tiny agency, so those companies could trust that they were hiring a big enough team that they could have faith in them. But the work was all being done, for the most part, by really, really small teams who sat across from each other, so they communicated all the time. They managed the growth of the agency by growing it in a small way, and I think it was fantastic. Now, you might say, well, that's fine, but it's an agency, it's on a smaller scale still, it's not an enterprise level thing. My other favorite example of managing this scaling is Apple. I've had a lot of friends over the years who've worked at Apple. Apple has tried to get me to work there as well, and they've explained the way their teams work really well. They don't have a traditional management hierarchy. They do a lot of things differently from every other kind of Fortune 500 company. And in Apple, this massive company, their teams, their software teams, their product teams are really tiny. Their industrial design team that Johnny Ive leads, it's about 12 people. The team that builds all these things that, well, they don't build them. They're all built in China. But the teams that build and design all these things that are used by so many people around the world, 12 people. And it's 12 people now. It wasn't always 12 people. Like, that's big. That's growth. I had a really good friend of mine who worked on the iWork team, so Pages, Numbers, and Keynote. She worked there for a while, prior to when it was on iOS and iPad. And it was a handful of people, much like the big spaceship model. It had maybe 8 to 10 people total that were responsible for the design, development, everything. My friend Eris, she was responsible for mainly calculus. So when there was any calculus needed in anything to build these apps, that was kind of her responsibility. They had an icon designer on the team, not like an Apple icon team, the iWork icon designer, right? That idea of having everything encapsulated in one little place meant that everyone was responsible for their job. When you showed up, you knew what your job was. You knew what your responsibility was. If you didn't show up, you knew that thing wasn't going to get done. And that built a great team environment. No one was scared of being replaced because there was very little overlap. And everyone was hired to be the best on that team because they had to, otherwise Apple wouldn't get software built. So a lot of good things happened from managing things in a small way. Also, when the iPad came out, Eris told me once that Steve brought her into the office, and maybe some of the other iWork team members, and handed over a prototype. This was about a year before it was actually announced and released, and said, "You have a year. Build iWork for this." So instead of growing the team, hiring a bunch of new people to task with learning how to develop for iOS, the team that already built these apps and had the experience in it learned how to build them for a different platform. It was very, very tightly constrained. By comparison, I mean, I heard once that years and years ago, that the kind of difference in size between the OS X team, which is kind of maybe a couple of dozen people at most for design and dev at that point, and the team that built Windows was 1,400 or 1,500. There are differences in approach, and it doesn't mean that with a small team you can't build something big. It totally changes the way that team operates, and that changes the end result. So it can happen on a massive scale, and Apple still works this way. It can happen, but only when it's managed like that. You can't retroactively go, we're going to make small teams now that we're 1,000 people. You have to know that from the beginning, and then you can manage it. So again, small startups behave this way because in small groupings, it's harder to avoid this communication. It just happens naturally. We're not doing it intentionally, it just happens. One of the other things that happens that I'll leave you with and we can wrap up, is that everyone ends up being involved from the beginning. This is one of our biggest gripes on larger teams when there's not communication between these silos. The silos build up, again, naturally. They don't have to be there. Every team I've worked on, when I've been hiring people with my agency in the States or working with people like Super Friendly, where I got to work with Tim under Dan Mall's agency last year, everyone talked to each other freely. We all had our tasks and our roles and our titles within the team, but that didn't matter. That didn't stop us talking. when that happens, it's brilliant because all sorts of magical stuff gets done well. When teams don't talk to each other, when roles don't talk to each other, a lot doesn't happen, and the things that do happen are battles and fights, and we waste a lot of time. When everyone's involved from the very beginning, a lot of that goes away, but that is really hard to do with large teams or teams that act large. There's nothing that stops you from bringing 15, 20 people into a kickoff meeting, right? So that they can at least hear what's being discussed. That doesn't happen a lot because people get very protective even at the top of what's being discussed and who has input. But if you've hired someone, if you're working with someone and you don't involve them from the beginning, to me, that's like saying that they don't have any valid input. And if they don't have any valid input, why have you hired them? Why are they on your team? Why are you working with them at all? If they're not going to have any valid input at the beginning, why would they possibly have any valid input halfway through the project when you start giving stuff to them? And actually, the reverse is exactly true, is that if you start from the very beginning, maybe they won't have anything to say, but maybe a week in, their brain will have been thinking about everything that was discussed, and before you get too far in, they'll go, oh, actually, you know what? I saw you guys talking about this in the kickoff, and I've been watching what's been happening on Basecamp, and that's going to cause us problems in dev in like 3 months when we start working on it, because you've involved them. That can't happen when you just hand over designs or wireframes, and that's the first they've heard about it. So, and this is a small team behavior, and it can happen on a large scale. We just have to be very conscious of it, and that's what I'm going to leave you with. This talk is purposely kind of trying to plant ideas in your head to think about the rest of the day and beyond. This isn't complicated, really. It doesn't require 10 lists of things, a list of 10 things to do. We just have to be aware that our natural tendency is to separate, is to isolate, and that's why it happens. And with a little bit of conscious effort, just to say, hey, I know why we're keeping this to 3 people. Let's just bring all 10 into this discussion. We can start to fix that by making sure people spend more face-to-face time. And maybe the people who need to be working together sit close to each other. These are really, really tiny things. Don't have the dev team over there and the design team over here. Mix people together when they're working together. Makes a huge difference. These tiny little things, even when your organization is already too big, you can start to overcome them. But especially if you're small and you might scale, be aware of this so that you can control it. And then what will happen is you'll protect the good parts of the communication as you grow. I'll leave you with that. There's a lot of amazing stuff to come the rest of the day. If you have any questions now, we're going to have a couple minutes for questions. If you don't, because I understand how that goes, it's still early, you need more coffee, I'm going to be around the rest of the day. Please come up and talk to me about what's going on in your organization or in your head. I'd love to chat. Thanks you very much for coming this morning.
Thank you very much, Dan. Again, a very inspiring talk.
My pleasure.
Does anyone...
Good morning, and thank you for this inspiring talk. I really had the same situation at my company, so I had an idea, tried to give it to the other levels, and they said, no, that's completely stupid. But I wanted to plant another idea, or I wanted to give another idea to you, because your idea of, or the metaphor you were giving of the people sitting in front of their computers and the headphones in, I was thinking about nearly the same thing, and I think it's maybe also the difference in time, in speed, in pace. I believe that on every hierarchy, a developer has its own pace. The management level has a different pace.
Completely.
And so if I'm managing a whole project, I'm not looking at a daily basis. I'm looking on a weekly or even monthly basis. And I also believe it's the point that if I send you an email, I think I get a response. I know I'm in a different time space with you when you're on a different hierarchy, but when I'm talking to another developer, or if one manager talks to another manager, and they are nearly in the same time and space, I believe. You think so too?
Well, yeah, no, the paces that we work are different, and that's completely okay. I don't think that's actually even if you were 4 people sitting around a table, you're going to be working at different paces. That's not something that leads to those kind of problems. What maybe is one of those problems when there becomes more separation between the layers, when management isn't sitting in the same place. There's the opportunity to forget about that difference, and if we forget that we all work at different paces and speeds within the bigger context of the project, that could be a problem. But and that does happen. But that's still a communication kind of issue. But it's communication. It's awareness. The way that good managers behave is very, very different. Good managers are incredibly aware of what their teams are good at and what they're doing, and they don't actually disconnect, even though their pace is slower and they're looking at a longer cycle. They're very aware of what kind of work is being done and churning away every day. And a lot of this comes down to awareness. It's just being aware that things like this happen naturally, and that when things happen naturally that create negative unintentional consequences, that's what's bad. It's not that the thing happens. It's that we have to be aware that it will happen if it gets out of control, and that awareness allows us to change our behavior and modify our behavior to just prevent the out of control stuff. And that's the same when we're talking about differences in operating speed and pace. Let's do one more question, because I know we've got to squeeze the next talk in here soon, and everyone's got to get to a different room. And come and find me at lunch or in between any of the breaks too.
I have a question.
Yes.
Is there a danger that this could also happen on a team level, this separation or isolation?
What size team?
Small teams, like you described them.
Is there a danger? Well, okay, so let's abstract that question one level. Is there a danger that we can forget our natural tendencies and our natural tendencies can lead to problems? Yes, always. This happens when someone's having a bad day and they snap at someone else just for some simple question, right? Our natural tendency is to not be aware necessarily when someone else is working to a deadline that you don't have. As an example, it could be the person next to you, and if you're not aware of what everyone else's stresses are, you might push their buttons unintentionally. So that stuff can happen. This is human interaction. It has nothing to do with teams. Have you ever been at a restaurant and a waitress or a waiter has just been downright rude to you? Yes? No one has ever had that experience, right? Yes, we've all had that experience. But what you don't know whether maybe they just got dumped that morning. Maybe they had a car accident. Maybe they just found out their mother has cancer. Or maybe they just had an argument with their boss because there are all sorts of situations that unless we're aware, we can't interact properly with the other person. And out in the world, there's not much we can do to be aware of that. But in teams, that communication helps us become aware of it. Talking to people, not just keeping things about business, actually learning about what the people you work with are up to in their free time, what's going on in their life, being interested in it, is really, really important. With the Super Friendly team, this I think is a good example. The teams that Super Friendly puts together are based on each project's requirements. So they're different each time. They're not people sitting across from each other at a desk, or people sitting across from an ocean and states away, hours and time zones away. Every time we get on a chat, we dive into Google Hangout, and for a good 10, 15, 20 minutes maybe, there's nothing being talked about the project. It's all just stuff. We're being very personal about each other because we're interested too. But it allows us to know the people, and that helps a ton. It helps a massive load. So that's a small team. It's a virtual team. That's actually one of the ways to get virtual teams working really well together, is just to talk to each other, not about just the work, but to make sure you know the people. It makes those emails you write much more personal, because they're not just an email address of someone who's not sitting in your same office. So yeah, it can happen, but it's all about the same thing. It's about our natural tendencies. We just have to understand what those are and make conscious decisions to avoid the negatives. I think we'll leave it at that. Thank you very much again for showing up and not being hungover, I hope. Enjoy the rest of the day and come and ask me anything you want later on. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Dan.